The asteroid belt designated Mr. 7 through Mr. 119 contained, by Jackson's last count, approximately 4,000 rocks with delusions of grandeur and nothing resembling a useful mineral deposit. He had been cataloging them for 3 weeks. He had given several of them names. He was not proud of this. He saved his report, closed the interface, and sat for a moment in the blue-gray hum of his workstation while the station's ventilation system did what it always did at the end of a shift, exhaled, long and slow, as if Velther itself was tired of the same routine. He understood the feeling. He pushed back from the desk, stood, and decided that what he needed was the one thing on this station that required nothing from him: the observation terrace on level 9, where the view was unreasonable and the railing was cold, and nobody expected a man to have opinions about anything. He took the lift. The lift played a soft instrumental piece that had no detectable beginning or end, which Jackson had decided was either very sophisticated or a malfunction that nobody had gotten around to reporting. He suspected the latter. The doors opened. The terrace was nearly empty, which was what he had wanted, and a woman was standing at the railing, which was something he had not accounted for. She stood with both hands resting on the rail, her posture carrying the particular stillness of someone who had long since made peace with where they were. The nebula outside, Orin's Veil, named after a cartographer who had, according to station records, described it as inconveniently beautiful, pressed against the viewport in bands of violet and deep amber, and the light came through it in a way that seemed to have opinions about where it landed. It landed at that moment on her. Her skin caught it in gold, her ears long, tapering to a gentle point in the manner of her people, and held with a kind of natural authority that made human ears seem like an afterthought evolution hadn't fully committed to, were lit at their edges in amber. She did not turn when he stepped onto the terrace. She was either deeply absorbed in the nebula or she had heard him coming and was taking her time deciding whether to acknowledge it. He suspected the latter. He was developing a habit of suspecting latter options. He walked to the railing. He left what he considered a respectful distance, enough space for 2 people to independently appreciate a nebula without it becoming a shared activity by default. He put his hands on the rail. The rail was cold. This was, as promised, correct. For approximately 90 seconds, neither of them said anything. The nebula shifted slightly in the way that nebulae do when observed, as if self-conscious. The station hummed. Somewhere behind them, a service drone rounded a corner, beeped once at something that was apparently in its path, and retreated. Jackson watched the violet bands of Orin's Veil move in their slow, indifferent drift and thought about nothing in particular, which was the first time in 3 weeks he had successfully managed it. Then he looked at her. He was not sure what he had intended to do after that. Look away, probably. Return to the nebula. Execute the standard sequence of polite non-interaction that strangers on observation terraces had been performing since humanity first put observation terraces on space stations, and then stood on them feeling simultaneously small and oddly social. What he had not planned was to notice, with the kind of clarity that arrives without invitation, that the light from the nebula was doing something very specific when it reached her eyes, catching in them in a color he did not have a precise word for, amber adjacent but not amber, something that moved when she did not. He said it before strategy had any opportunity to get involved. "Your eyes," he said, "are beautiful." It was simple, it was undecorated. It was the kind of sentence that arrives honest because there was no time to dress it up. And in that way it was perhaps more true than most things he had said in the past 3 weeks, which had largely consisted of mineral classifications and requests for the station kitchen to please, at some point, make something that wasn't described on the menu as protein forward. She turned. She looked at him with an expression that was not immediately readable, not guarded exactly, but private, the way certain rooms in certain houses feel private before you're invited in. It moved through something he couldn't name. Then it arrived somewhere else, and what it arrived at was a smile, and the smile was directed at him with a specificity that made it feel distinct from any smile he had observed her give to anyone or anything, including the nebula, which he felt was honestly putting in a strong effort. "You lead with eyes," she said. Her voice carried the faint, unhurried quality of someone who has said interesting things so often that she no longer needs to announce them. Humans always do. As if the rest of a person is something you intend to get to eventually, if there's time. Jackson considered this. "In my defense," he said, "there's a lot going on with the nebula. I'm working through things in order." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with the calm confidence of someone who already knows the answer to the question they're about to ask, "I have something better. Would you like to see?" He looked at her for a moment that was longer than a moment in the way that certain moments are, the kind that expand quietly in the middle without calling attention to it, the way the station's artificial gravity occasionally did something subtle to the inner ear, and you only noticed it after the fact. She was still smiling. She was not filling the silence with anything, which he found both impressive and faintly alarming, because, in his experience, people who were comfortable with silence had usually done something with their lives that gave them the right to be. "Yes," he said. She held out her hand. He looked at it. It was a perfectly ordinary hand, golden-skinned, steady, offered with the naturalness of someone who had extended hands toward things worth moving toward many times before and had never once been wrong about the direction. He took it. Her fingers closed around his with a matter-of-fact warmth, and she turned from the railing and led him back across the terrace toward the corridor without any of the ceremony that Jackson felt the occasion probably deserved, though he was aware he could not have specified what ceremony would have been appropriate. A brief fanfare, perhaps, a drone announcement, something. The corridor she turned into was not one he recognized. This was, objectively, strange. Jackson had been on Velthor Station for 22 days. He had, in the quiet desperation of his first week, memorized the station map. Not because he expected to need it, but because memorizing things was what he did when a new environment made him feel like a piece of furniture that hadn't decided where it belonged yet. He knew Level 9. He knew its 4 corridors, its 2 service bays, its single functioning water dispenser, and the non-functioning one that still made a hopeful sound when you walked past it. He did not know this corridor. It was not dramatically different from the others. It had the same brushed metal walls, the same recessed lighting that Velthor's designers had presumably chosen to suggest calm, and had instead achieved something closer to the lighting in rooms where people wait for news. But it curved in a direction that his mental map had assigned to an exterior hull section, which should have contained nothing but insulation, structural support, and the particular silence of deep space doing what it does best. "This corridor," he said, "is not on the map." "Most interesting things aren't," Zoe said, without slowing down. He decided this was either profound or deflection, and that either way it did not change the fact that he was still walking. They moved deeper in. The station's hum changed pitch slightly, lower, more deliberate, like a held note in a piece of music that was building towards something without announcing what. Jackson noticed this and chose not to mention it on the grounds that he had already mentioned the corridor, and felt he had filled his quota of observations that might make him sound nervous. He was, marginally, nervous. This seemed reasonable. "How long have you been on Velthor?" he asked. "Long enough to have found the corridors that don't appear on the map," she said, "and short enough that I still find them interesting. It's a good window." "What do you do here?" he asked on the station. She glanced back at him, and the look carried something briefly amused in it, as if she had answered this question many times and had developed a quiet fondness for the version of it that sounded like small talk but wasn't. "I map things," she said. "Specifically, things that don't stay in one place long enough to be mapped properly." Jackson processed this. That sounds like a profession designed by someone who enjoys being frustrated. "It sounds exactly like that," she agreed, with a warmth that suggested frustration and love were, in her experience, not always distinguishable. "What about you?" You said something about eyes and nebulae and working through things in order. That implies a methodology. Mineral cataloging, he said. Asteroid belt Mr. 7 through Mr. 119. She was quiet for a step. And how is that? I've named several of the asteroids. Professionally, personally, the designations committee would not approve my names. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not one, something that lived between those two things comfortably, like it had furnished the space and intended to stay. What did you name them? The large one near the belt center is Gerald, he said. He has a very stable orbit, it suits him. She stopped walking. For one brief, unreadable second he thought he had miscalculated something, gone too far, landed wrong, misjudged the register of a woman who mapped unmappable things and knew corridors that weren't on the official record. Then she turned to look at him fully, and the expression on her face was the one he had seen arrive on the terrace, the one that had moved through something private before settling somewhere he was apparently allowed to be, except that now it was warmer and more decided, and directed at him without any of the remaining reserve it had carried before. Gerald, she said. Gerald, he confirmed. She turned back and continued walking, and the smile stayed, and the corridor curved again, and the station's hum dropped another half note into something that resonated faintly in his chest, and Jackson walked beside her through a part of Velther that the map had never mentioned, and thought that 3 weeks of asteroids had perhaps been, in some structural narrative sense, the opening act. The corridor ended in a door that was not dramatic about it. This was almost disappointing. Jackson had been walking through an unmapped section of a deep space station with a woman who mapped things that refused to be mapped, and some part of him had expected the door to be, he wasn't sure, larger, more gothic, possessed of a wheel-lock mechanism and an atmosphere of earned mystery. Instead, it was a standard Velther interior panel, gray-framed, with a small access console on the right that Zoe touched with the casual authority of someone entering their own kitchen. The door opened. She walked through. He followed. What was on the other side was not a kitchen. The room was circular, which was the first thing he noticed, because Velther Station was not a circular kind of place. It was a place of right angles and practical decisions and corridors that went where they were supposed to go, except apparently for the one they had just come from. The ceiling arched upward in a smooth dome, and set into the dome at intervals were instruments he recognized in category, if not in specific: sensor arrays, frequency monitors, spectral readers, but arranged in a configuration he had not seen before, oriented not outward toward space in the conventional sense, but angled in a way that suggested they were listening for something that moved through space rather than existing in it. In the center of the room, a console curved in a low arc around a single chair. The chair was worn in the particular way that things get worn when one person has spent a great deal of time in them thinking. On the console, several displays ran data in quiet streams, coordinates that shifted, waveform readings that pulsed at irregular intervals, and one screen that showed nothing but a slowly rotating geometric shape that Jackson could not immediately classify, which bothered him more than he felt was proportionate. "What is that shape?" he asked. "That," Zoe said, moving to the console with the ease of someone returning to a conversation they'd left briefly, "is the current geometric approximation of the event's leading edge. It changes. We update the model every few hours." "The event," Jackson said. "The reason this station exists," she said. She looked at him. "Did you read the station's founding documentation when you arrived?" "I read the mineral survey brief and the section on cafeteria hours," he said. "In my defense, the founding documentation was 412 pages, and the cafeteria closes at 2100. Zoe looked at him with an expression that managed to be simultaneously judging and fond, which was a combination he had previously believed required years of familiarity to achieve. "Velther Station," she said, settling into the worn chair and pulling one of the displays toward her, "was not built to monitor asteroid belts. The asteroid belt monitoring was added later as a secondary function, because the station needed a published operational purpose that didn't require explaining the primary one. Jackson stood very still. What is the primary one? She pulled up something on the display and turned it so he could see. It was a timeline not of station history, but of an event, recurring, irregular, logged across decades. The earliest entry was dated 63 years ago. The most recent was dated 11 days before his arrival. The intervals between entries were not consistent. They followed no pattern he could immediately identify, which meant either the pattern was complex or there wasn't one, and in his experience, the universe preferred complex patterns to the absence of them. It has no agreed name, Zoe said. My people call it something that translates roughly as the fold between breaths. Station records call it phenomenon Velther primary. The crew mostly calls it the event, with a capital letter that you can hear when they say it. What does it do? Jackson asked. It's easier to show you than to explain, she said, which is, to be clear, why you're here. He looked at her. When you said you had something better than your eyes to show me, you meant this. The room, the phenomenon. Yes, she said. He considered this for a moment. Part of him, a part that had apparently survived 3 weeks of asteroid cataloging with its optimism mysteriously intact, had been operating under a different interpretation of the invitation. He decided not to share this with her on the grounds that it would make him sound like a man who had not read 412 pages of founding documentation, and had also perhaps made certain assumptions. Both of these things were true, they did not need to be said aloud. Right, he said. The phenomenon, excellent, that's yes. When does it happen? Zoe glanced at one of the pulsing waveform displays. Approximately 40 minutes from now, if the leading edge holds its current trajectory. It rarely holds its current trajectory. So possibly longer. Possibly longer, she confirmed. Possibly shorter. One entry in the records notes that a researcher waited 9 days. Jackson looked at the single worn chair at the console, and then at the rest of the circular room, which contained no other seating. He found a section of console edge that appeared structurally adequate and leaned against it. 9 days, he said. That researcher had commitment. She also brought snacks, Zoe said. I should have mentioned that, I apologize. I had dinner, he said. It was protein forward. She looked at him. Is that a Velther cafeteria description? It's their description for everything that isn't Gerald. This time she laughed fully. Not the between laugh sound from the corridor, but the real thing, unheld, arriving without announcement the way the best laughs do. It moved through the circular room, and the instruments caught it briefly in the way that sensitive equipment sometimes catches sounds it was not designed for, registering something at the edge of its range that it cannot quite classify but records anyway. Jackson smiled. The geometric shape on the display rotated slowly. The waveforms pulsed. Somewhere in the space outside the dome above them, something that had no agreed-upon name was moving through the dark in their direction, at its own pace, on its own terms, as it had been doing for 63 years before either of them were here to wait for it. 40 minutes passed without the event. This was, according to Zoe, completely normal. Jackson took this information with the equanimity of a man who had once spent 6 hours waiting for a mineral spectrometer to recalibrate, and had emerged from the experience changed in ways he could not fully articulate. They talked. It began, as conversations in waiting rooms tend to begin, with the practical and the proximate. How long the waveform readings had been showing this particular configuration, what the leading-edge geometry meant in terms of proximity, whether the station's orientation had been adjusted to optimize the dome sensors, which apparently it had 3 days ago, by an engineer named Fenn, who Zoe described as deeply competent and constitutionally opposed to being thanked for it. Jackson had not met Fenn. He felt, based on this description, that Fenn and Gerald would have understood each other. Then the conversation moved, the way good conversations do when neither person is directing them, through less practical territory. Zoe talked about her work with the unhurried fluency of someone who had long since stopped needing to justify loving it. The phenomena she mapped were not, she explained, anomalies in the conventional sense. They were not errors in space, not ruptures or instabilities. They were, as best as her field could determine, the ordinary behavior of something that existed at a scale that made ordinary human and Valthorian instruments look like a child, holding a ruler up to the horizon. Trying to map them was not unlike, she said, trying to draw a portrait of something that was not in the room but whose presence you could infer from the way everything else in the room was leaning slightly in one direction. Jackson thought about this. So you spend your career measuring the lean, he said. She pointed at him. Exactly that, yes. And does the lean, he said, ever resolve into something that looks like a portrait? She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he could hear the waveform monitors doing their patient, repetitive work, and the low-noted hum of the station, and somewhere above them in the dome, the sensors making their fine adjustments. Once, she said, I was on a survey vessel in the Marath system 4 years ago. Something moved through the region, not this one, a different class of event entirely, and for approximately 90 seconds, every instrument we had produced data that was internally consistent, mutually corroborating, and completely unlike anything in the existing literature. She paused. We spent 8 months trying to publish it. What happened? 3 reviewers called it instrument error. One called it, and I am quoting directly, a charming anomaly. Charming, Jackson repeated. He meant it as a dismissal, Zoe said. I chose to receive it as a compliment. It seemed more useful. Jackson looked at her. She was leaning back slightly in the worn chair, one hand resting on the edge of the console in the posture of someone who had learned how to be comfortable in rooms where waiting was the primary activity. The amber light from the displays moved across the angles of her face, and her ears caught it at their tips the way they had caught the nebula light on the terrace, which was something he noticed, and then noticed himself noticing, which he felt was becoming a pattern worth acknowledging internally if not aloud. What about you, she said. It was not quite a question. The asteroids, the names. You didn't come to a deep space station to catalog rocks, or if you did, that's not the whole of it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside people, he had found, sometimes interpreted his quietness before answering as reluctance. It was not reluctance. It was the same instinct that made him name the asteroids, a preference for finding the right thing rather than the fast thing. I came, he said, because the posting was as far from everything familiar as the available postings got, and because I had been in the same place for a long time, professionally and otherwise. And the problem with staying in the same place for a long time is that you start to mistake the familiar for the necessary. The rocks needed cataloging, and I needed, he stopped. The lean, Zoe said. He looked at her. Something like that, he said. She nodded once slowly in the manner of someone who has heard a true thing and is giving it the space it deserves rather than rushing to fill the air around it. Then one of the waveform displays changed. Not dramatically, not with any of the urgency that the word change usually implies, but in the way that things change when a process that has been building for a long time reaches a threshold it has been approaching quietly. The pulsing rhythm shifted. A second monitor woke from what Jackson had assumed was a standby state and began producing readings in a column of pale blue numerals that scrolled upward with increasing speed. Zoe sat forward. It's early, she said, and her voice had changed, not alarmed, not even surprised exactly, but focused in the way that a lens focuses when something worth seeing comes into range. Good early or bad early? Jackson asked. Early is always good, she said. The ones that come early are the ones that held their shape. She was moving across the displays now with practiced efficiency, pulling readings, cross-referencing, doing several things simultaneously in the manner of someone for whom this room and its instruments were an extension of thought rather than a separate operation. Come here, she said without looking up. Stand in the center of the room. Jackson stood up from the console edge. Should I be concerned about anything specific, he said, or just generally? Generally is fine, she said. And Jackson? She looked up then briefly, and the expression was the one that had moved through private rooms and arrived somewhere warmer, except that now it carried something additional, anticipation. And beneath that, the specific pleasure of being about to show someone something that has been worth waiting for. Don't look at the instruments, she said. Look up. He walked to the center of the room and looked up at the dome, where the sensors were making no sound at all now, where the dome itself seemed to be holding still in a way that felt intentional, where the pale blue light from the waking monitor was climbing the curved walls in slow, rising increments, and where the space beyond the dome's material, deep, dark, indifferent, enormous, was doing something that he could not yet see but could feel in the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, in the way you feel the lean before you see what's causing it, in the way certain things announce themselves to the body before they bother with the eyes. It began at the edges. Not the edges of the dome, not the edges of the room, but the edges of things, the place where the pale blue monitor light met the darker air, the place where the curve of the dome met the space beyond it, the place where Jackson's peripheral vision ended and the rest of the universe began. Something moved there. Not moved the way objects move, with trajectory and velocity and the decency to be trackable, but moved the way meaning moves through a sentence you've read 3 times before it opens, present the whole time, suddenly undeniable. He kept his eyes on the dome. The sensors had gone completely silent. Not offline. He could see from the corner of his eye that Zoe's displays were still running, still scrolling their pale numerals upward at a pace that had become too fast to read. But silent in the way that listening is silent, the way a room full of people goes quiet when something begins that they all came to hear. The station's hum, which had been his constant companion for 22 days, dropped away. He had not realized until it was gone how much of his awareness it had been occupying, the way you don't notice a sound until the moment it stops, and the absence of it arrives like a new kind of presence. Then the dome changed. It did not shatter. It did not go transparent in any mechanical sense. The material was the same. He could see its surface, could see the faint structural grid of it, but through it, or perhaps instead of it, or perhaps alongside it in a way that did not obey the convention of things being in one place at a time, something else was also there. A depth that had not been there before. Not the depth of space, which Jackson knew and had catalogued and had named pieces of a different depth. A depth that went in a direction he did not have a word for, that his eyes followed without being able to report back accurately on where they had been. It lasted 40 seconds. He knew this afterward from Zoe's records. While it was happening, he had no access to time in any useful sense. Time was present the way furniture is present in a dark room. He knew it was there somewhere. He was reasonably confident he would encounter it again, but it was not currently relevant to what was happening to him. What was happening to him was this. He understood, without being told, and without the understanding arriving through any of the channels he normally used for understanding things, that the event Zoe had spent years mapping was not a phenomenon in the sense that weather was a phenomenon or a mineral deposit was a phenomenon, something that existed and could be measured and filed. It was more like a reminder, something that existed at a scale that made the station and the asteroid belt and Gerald with his stable orbit, and the Marath system and Orin's veil with its inconvenient beauty, all simultaneously true and approximately the size of a thought, not diminished, but contextualized, the way a single word is not diminished by being part of a sentence. He was not frightened. This surprised him later. At 38 seconds it began to recede, not quickly, with the same unhurried quality that it had arrived with, pulling back through the edges of things the way meaning pulls back from a sentence when you've understood it and no longer need to hold it so tightly. The dome returned to being only a dome. The station's hum came back, and he noticed it returning the same way he had noticed its absence, as a kind of arrival. The pale blue numerals on Zoe's display slowed, then settled into a steady, quiet pulse. Jackson stood in the center of the room. He did not speak for what was probably a reasonable amount of time and felt like either 30 seconds or several geological epochs. Zoe did not rush him. She was at the console, moving through the data with focused attention, her hands working the displays in the efficient sequence of someone capturing something before it shifts. But he was aware that part of her attention was elsewhere on him, watching the way she had watched on the terrace, with the patience of someone who has shown a particular thing to a particular person and is waiting without pressure to see where they land. He became aware that he was still looking at the dome. He lowered his gaze. Zoe was looking at him. Her expression was careful and warm and curious in the way that expressions are curious when they already have a hypothesis but are interested in the data. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "That was," he started. "Yes," she said again. He looked at the dome once more briefly as if checking that it was still only a dome. It was. "I have a question," he said. "All right." "The researcher who waited 9 days," he said. "When it happened, did she?" He stopped. He tried again. Was it the same for her? Zoe considered this. "Her log entry for the 40 seconds of the event is 4 words," she said. Jackson waited. "She wrote," Zoe said. "Well, that was something." He looked at her. "That's a good log entry," he said. "It's the most cited entry in the station's entire research archive," Zoe said. And there was something in the way she said it that moved through Fond and arrived at something that had more weight to it. The specific warmth of a person who loves their field, not despite its resistance to language, but because of it. Because the gap between the experience and the words for it was not a failure but the most honest map of all. He nodded slowly in the way she had nodded earlier when he'd said a true thing and she had given it room. Then he said, "I owe Gerald an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "For thinking a stable orbit was the most interesting thing in this belt," he said. The laugh arrived the same way the good one had in the circular room before, without announcement, unheld. But this one was quieter than the earlier laugh, softer at its edges, the kind that comes when something is funny and also, underneath the funny, genuinely true. She shook her head once, still smiling, and turned back to her displays, and Jackson stood in the center of the room where the edges of things had briefly done something without a name, and felt, with a clarity that required no instruments to measure, that the familiar and the necessary were not, after all, the same thing. They walked back through the corridor that wasn't on the map, and this time Jackson paid attention to it differently. Not with the mild alarm of the first pass, when his memorized layout had protested its existence, but with the particular attention you give to a place once you know it has earned its obscurity. The brushed metal walls were the same. The curve was the same, but he moved through it now the way you move through a sentence on a second reading, the words unchanged, the meaning rearranged. Zoe walked beside him rather than ahead of him. This was different from the journey in, and he noticed it the way he had been noticing things all evening, which was to say with more precision than he usually applied to the world and less self-consciousness about the precision. Their steps fell into an easy rhythm without either of them arranging it. The station hummed around them at its normal pitch, restored to its habitual note, and Jackson found he was glad to hear it, not because the silence during the event had been unwelcome, but because the return of ordinary sound was its own kind of information, a confirmation that ordinary things were still in attendance and had waited patiently. "How many times have you seen it?" he asked. 17, she said, "and it's the same each time." She was quiet for a step in the way he had learned in the course of one evening meant she was finding the right thing rather than the fast thing. He recognized this because it was his own habit, and recognizing it in someone else had the particular quality of finding a word in a foreign language that your own language has never quite managed. "The event is the same," she said. "I'm not the same, so it's different each time." He thought about this. "The first time," he said. "How old were you?" 26, she said. "I was a junior researcher on a mapping survey. I had been assigned to monitor the preliminary sensor readings, which was the kind of task given to junior researchers to keep them occupied while the senior staff did the actual work. She paused. The senior staff missed it. They were in the common room. There was apparently a card game. Jackson looked at her. You watched it alone. I wrote 4 words in the log and then I sat in that room for 2 hours afterward, she said. Not because I couldn't leave. Because I didn't want to be somewhere else yet. He understood this completely and said so, and she glanced at him sideways with an expression that was brief and unguarded, and landed somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum with more accuracy than he felt was strictly necessary. The corridor returned them to level 9 with the same lack of drama with which it had received them. The standard junction, the familiar lighting, the non-functioning water dispenser making its hopeful sound as they passed. Jackson looked at it. I've been on this station 22 days, he said, and I've never once investigated why that dispenser makes that sound. It's a pressure valve, Zoe said. It's been partially engaged for about 8 months. Fen knows about it. And Fen feels it adds character, she said. Jackson nodded seriously. Fen and Gerald would get along. They reached the terrace. The door opened and the view arrived the way it always did, without preparation, immediate, the kind of thing that should have become routine and hadn't. Oren's veil had shifted in their absence. Its violet bands deepened toward something closer to blue at the edges. The amber threads in it, pulled longer and thinner by whatever internal process, governed a nebula's slow, indifferent rearrangement of itself. It looked, Jackson thought, like something that had been waiting for them to come back and had used the time productively. They went to the railing. He put his hands on the cold metal. She stood beside him with both hands on the rail in the posture he had first seen from across the terrace. Except that now he was not across the terrace, and she was not a woman defined by her stillness and the quality of light on her face, but a person he had walked through unmapped corridors with, and waited with, and watched something wordless with, and laughed with in a circular room full of instruments that measured things by their effect on everything else. The nebula did what nebulae do. The station hummed. Somewhere behind them, the service drone that had beeped at something earlier in the evening made its rounds again, found whatever had been in its path apparently resolved, and continued without comment. I'm going to read the founding documentation, Jackson said. All 412 pages, Zoe asked. I'll start with 400 and work up to it, he said, gradually, with adequate protein. She smiled at the nebula. The appendices are where it gets interesting, she said. There's a section in Appendix C written by the station's original chief scientist. She spent 6 pages trying to describe the event and then wrote, at the end of the 6th page, that she was going to stop trying and simply ensure the station had good enough instruments to keep watching it. Wise woman, Jackson said. She also specified in the operational guidelines that the monitoring room should have only 1 chair, Zoe said, so that whoever was watching would always have a reason to bring someone with them. Jackson was quiet for a moment. He looked at the nebula. He thought about a chief scientist who had understood, 63 years ago, that the best reason to keep a spare chair out of a room was not economy but company. He thought about junior researchers left alone with card games happening elsewhere in 4 words that had become the most cited log entry in the archive. He thought about Gerald, stable in his orbit, unbothered, reliable, not the most interesting thing in the belt. Zoe, he said. Yes, she said. Tomorrow, he said, I'm going to file a formal request to have Gerald's designation updated in the mineral survey records. She turned to look at him. To what? I haven't decided yet, he said. I thought I might ask someone with experience naming things that are difficult to classify. She looked at him for a moment with the expression that had moved through private rooms on the terrace 2 hours ago, except that it had been through more rooms since then, and had arrived somewhere that had no remaining reserve in it, somewhere that was simply open in the way that things are open when they have decided to be. I'll need to think about it, she said. I have time, he said. The asteroids aren't going anywhere, Gerald especially. She turned back to the railing. the nebula shifted another degree in its slow process of being itself. Her shoulder was close to his in the way that distance is close when two people have stopped maintaining them on purpose, and neither of them moved away. And the station held them both in its hum and its gravity and its corridors mapped and unmapped. And outside the viewport the universe continued its ancient, enormous work of being full of things that arrived without announcement and could not quite be named and were, for that reason, worth every minute of the waiting.